Department of Communities and Justice. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Aboriginal land on which we're all sitting today. I'm coming to you from Wongal country and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to Aboriginal colleagues with us today. So welcome. It's a great opportunity to be able to talk to you today about this work we've been doing around youth evidence, around building the evidence base for good youth work. This is an opportunity this morning for us to share some key learnings and findings from the review, from those evidence reviews, and also to hear back from you about your thoughts and views about the work. I'd like to thank the Research Centre for Children and Families, Dr. Amy Connolly-White and her team for all the work they've done on the reviews. It's a significant piece of work, and they've been really great research partners to work with. I'd also like to thank Youth Action and Youth Work New South Wales as well, who have been involved in this work, and thank you very much for your contribution and support. Okay, so this work is really about an opportunity to present two evidence reviews, one that looked at socio-emotional wellbeing in regards to youth work practice, and also a second review that looked at youth work, the evidence around youth work practice, particularly focusing on agency and empowerment. So throughout the morning session, there'll be discussion about the key findings of the work and its relevance to youth work practice, and also importantly, give you an opportunity to ask questions, but also to hear your views about the evidence. We're particularly keen to hear back from you about whether this evidence really resonates with you, how this relates to your practice, and any thoughts that you may have around, how this evidence might be, currently being implemented in practice, or in future possibly as well, because that's certainly something that we want to look to do in the future. Okay, so the background for this work is really about, supporting the evidence-informed practice approach which DCJ has been endeavouring to drive through our early intervention programs, particularly our targeted early intervention program. So we're really been looking quite closely at a lot of the evidence around early intervention to help, make sure that we're designing and delivering programs and supporting you as well in designing and delivering programs informed by the best evidence available. So when we talk about our evidence-informed practice approach, we're really talking about the research evidence. So what does the research say works in improving outcomes, but also importantly, professional expertise and practitioner evidence. So the voice of practitioners and also the voice of clients as well. So those three key components are important in terms of our evidence-informed practice approach. So these evidence reviews are really an effort to kind of surface that, particularly the research evidence, and also some of the practice evidence as well that is available, and certainly that providers that are here today have been delivering over the years. And that evidence is important in terms of, as I mentioned, allows us in DCJ to try and drive that evidence back through our early intervention programs and support providers to be able to use that evidence. We know that using evidence in the design and delivery of programs is important. We know that it improves outcomes for young people. We know that you know this as well, and we see that in the work that you do. We see that in the work that you do in delivering and improving outcomes for young people. And we want to make sure that that research evidence and that practice evidence is available. I think it's fair to say that DCJ has probably not put as much effort into understanding some of the evidence and practice evidence in particular around youth work practice as we could have in the past. And this work is an effort to support the ongoing work in terms of youth work practice. We value the work that youth workers do. We know it's important, and we want to put more effort into supporting that work. This work will be available on the DCJ evidence portal, so some of you may have had an opportunity to have a look at that. That it'll be available on the portal, and we'll start to talk with you more over the next few months around how we can support you to use this evidence to design and deliver your services. And particularly we're working with Youth Action and Youth Work New South Wales as well around how we might do that. So we'll certainly be in contact with you soon around that. Okay, that's really all for me to start with. I might hand over to Howard Sercombe, who now is going to talk to you about a bit more about the evidence review. Howard, are you online?
You can see his name's there.
Yeah.
I'll text
Yeah, he's
message
just
him.
put into the chat that he's having tech problems, no mic or video.
Oh no.
I think
okay.
a couple of people are having tech problems. It seems like there are a couple of comments about audio issues.
That's right. So it's possible that Howard might be not identified as a presenter. So if you like, I can cover these points. Or Kate, I don't know if you'd like to speak to anything
Howard.
about in terms of the value of evidence for youth work practice.
Sorry, Amy, Howard might be able to speak now. Howard, are you there?
Oh.
Yeah, hang on. Yes, I can. Thank you. There's a mad scrabble at this end to try and get something to work. I guess I'd like to start by thanking the team for their work in this area. I think it's one of those fields. I mean, I think one of the things within youth work that we feel quite intensely and struggle with is sometimes about the lack of recognition for our practice and for the validity of our practice. And this is one of the elements of this. I remember when I was in the UK, a chairperson of a standing committee for the National Parliament saying he'd never seen any evidence that youth work does anything significant or good, which I was furious about, obviously. But then that led to the question: well, what kind of evidence are you looking for? And clearly, the kind of evidence that worked for that person was not the kind of evidence that we were working with and that made sense of our practice every day. So that's by way of introduction. What we mean by evidence is about the warrant for knowledge, the kinds of things that establish that things work, and therefore the justification for our action. One of the things that I would have said to him is that people's practice on the ground is always evidence-based. There's all sorts of evidence that we're looking for all the time. Maybe it's that just sideways look from a young person and a bit of a smile that shows that they are connected, that they are engaged, that this is working for them. Maybe it's the way in which the energy of a space lifts when something's going on. All of those kinds of things are evidence. The thing is, where is that kind of evidence recognised? And part of the problem is that we are dependent on the resources of others for the work that we do, on the resources that come from government or from larger organisations or from various kinds of sources. And therefore, the justification for our action, the evidence that supports our action, needs to be the kind of evidence that they recognise. Now, that kind of evidence, the sort of research evidence, those sorts of things, will always need to be translated into practice. They'll always need to be translated into the particular, the contextual, what is going to work with this particular young person in this setting or this particular group of young people. But part of the problem in recognising the worth of our sector is our ability to work with the kinds of evidence that make sense to the people who hold the purse strings and the people in power. I think that goes in two different directions. One of those is to be able to use the kind of evidence that is recognised within those kinds of circles, to be able to see what the research is saying and to see how that works within our particular practice, within our local area, within our agency, with the young people that we're working with. And also to be able to translate the things that we are learning and the things that we know about young people and the things that we see happening on the ground and the trends that are developing with the young people that we're working with, and to be able to translate that into the kind of evidence that is recognised as being valid in the bigger circles as well. So part of that's about being serious about evaluation. Part of that's about seeing what we can do to bring universities and researchers on side to look at what we know, to understand what it is that we are learning from our context, and to write and have the things that we are knowing or things that we have hunches about available for others in the public sphere. So all of those areas are things, are reasons why an evidence review like this is important. If we want recognition within the kinds of spheres in which decisions are made about our practice, then we need to both engage with the kinds of evidence that makes sense in those spheres and to start having input into those kinds of areas. Evidence is always part of knowledge systems. When you're in a youth work practice on the ground, you have a knowledge system that works there. There's evidence that you pick up. If you don't know stuff, there's places that you go and look. Maybe that's talking to colleagues, or maybe it's seeing what's around in your local area, or having those kinds of conversations. And that's the kind of knowledge that works for us, generally speaking, in practice. But within the corridors where decisions are being made, we need to also recognise the kind of knowledge that makes sense in those kinds of contexts as well. So if we want our practice to count in those places, then it needs to align with the kind of evidence that counts in those places. And lots of that evidence is powerful and useful. And when we bring it into our practice, it can make it more efficient, more effective, more workable. But I think historically we've not been well connected with that. And I think this project is a resource that hopefully will enable that to be easier and to make it more accessible.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you, Anthony. That was a terrific introduction for the conversation we're going to have today. So my name is Amy Conley-Wright. I'm the director for the Research Centre for Children and Families. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting throughout wherever we may be, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to extend that respect to Aboriginal colleagues who are with us today. I'm really keen to have this conversation with you and to introduce my colleagues. So I'm here with Laura Metcalf, who's has a PhD candidate in the law school at the University of Sydney, and is also a research assistant with the Research Centre for Children and Families, and Rebecca Mawad, who is also a research assistant for the Research Centre for Children and Families and an MPhil candidate at the University of Sydney. And it's been a real pleasure to be on this journey with colleagues at DCJ and with Youth Work New South Wales and Youth Action to begin to have this conversation about the relevance of evidence in terms of youth work practice. And we hope to continue that conversation today around connecting the evidence base to the work that you do, to validate, to explore, and to acknowledge the limitations of the literature that's out there, that doesn't necessarily capture all the kind of dimensions of the work that you do, and how we can sort of collectively build that evidence together. So we're going to be presenting 2 pieces of work which were sent to you in advance. So we hope that you had a chance to look at those. That can inform our conversation. You can refer back to the email that you received from DCJ. They're quite sort of packed with detail, and we want to make sure that we have time for conversation alongside presenting some of the key findings. So we'll just be kind of giving kind of this overview, and then inviting you to join us in this conversation. So you can put some comments into the chat if you like, but we also have a Mentimeter set up. So as you can see in the chat, there's a code. You go to menti.com and you put the code in, and that will enable everyone to be part of answering some questions about the relevance of this to your work. And that can really help us sort of identify where there's relevance, where there's gaps. So I'll jump in now into this youth evidence review on social emotional well-being. So we began this journey in 2021 with Department of Communities and Justice and the effort, as Anthony said, to build the evidence base that's available through the evidence portal. We started with an evidence and gap map to get a sense of what interventions are out there around young people. And so that's a piece of work that was completed. And it really identified that, a lot of the material that was out there about young people and young people who may be vulnerable fell into kind of 2 areas around social emotional well-being and what kind of practices can foster social emotional well-being in young people, and also risky behaviors. So how can you reduce risky behaviors such as sexual risk-taking behaviors, substance abuse, and general risk-taking? And so a lot of the literature really focuses on risk, but there was an interest, from DCJ to really focus on what are the ways to build protective factors and to build social emotional well-being. So that became the focus of our first evidence review. So social emotional well-being is essential for our overall health and well-being, and it's about helping young people to realize their abilities to cope with the normal stresses of day-to-day life, to work productively, and to contribute to their communities. So we began this process and looked across the evidence that was published in this space, building off of the evidence and gap map, and I'll go into some detail about our approach. We identified 32 programs that were evidence-informed programs that foster social emotional well-being in young people. The key outcomes for these programs include social skills and communication, self-efficacy and confidence, emotional regulation, and self-regulation, and decision-making and problem-solving. And we identified, some of the kind of core practices that are common across those programs. And there's a request to send that evidence again, which maybe DCJ can do that so you can have a look as we're discussing it. I want to identify some caveats and some limitations at the beginning, and then we'll return to these. That, we find that the evidence often comes from places like the United States because we're looking at experimental research, quasi-experimental research, and so only 2 of the studies that we drew on were from the Australian context, and these studies did not include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people and culturally and linguistically diverse young people. So that's a key part of the evidence base that we really need to build is, incorporating the populations and making sure that we're looking at interventions that have been trialed with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and CALD young people. So the evidence review, it was conducted using the specifications from the Department of Communities and Justice evidence rating scale. And again, that's looking at evidence that meets that standard of having a randomized control trial, quasi-experimental study. So meeting a very high threshold for evidence. And then looking at that evidence and screening it to see if there's some evidence of risk of bias. So the quality, examining the quality of those studies, and then trying to extract across studies to say, for those programs that have, good evidence behind them, what do we see as common elements that go across different programs? And common elements is the idea that, while you can have a specific program curriculum for a particular intervention, a lot of those types of interventions have underneath them core pieces that are common to them. So different practices that you can combine in different ways, but it's, really thinking about how can we flexibly use these practices that have some evidence behind them. So we identified core components in these programs that look like, in terms of high quality programs with good evidence that foster social emotional well-being in young people. And these types of components are recommended in programs that are seeking to build those types of outcomes around social skills and communication, self-efficacy and confidence, emotional regulation, decision-making and problem solving. So these types of practices include building motivation and monitoring behavioral change. So this is really about supporting young people to build their motivation to change their behavior over time. It can be around considering and changing otherwise risky behavioral choices or plan healthy choices that can promote their social emotional well-being. It can involve a component around screening or personalized assessment to inform a tailored response to young people. And it can include having feedback so that you can support that behavioral change over time. Mindfulness and self-regulation emerged also as something that the different programs are using to support social emotional well-being. And this is strategies to support self-regulation, to deal with stress, and to support emotional regulation. So this involves honing somatic awareness so that young people have that awareness around calming the body, managing their emotions, relieving their stress, and can involve practices like self-regulation, journaling, physical activities like yoga, mindfulness exercises. Self-concept and self-efficacy are about fostering self-efficacy and self-awareness through positive self-identity, which can include embracing their connection to self and to culture, and to foster autonomy and independence, and can involve skill building and self-efficacy skills such as refusal, assertiveness, critical thinking skills, and also cognitive skills that help young people appraise a situation where they might have an emotional response and think about how they can respond to those in a positive way. Pro-social skills and relationship building is about building social skills to positively interact with their peers and with community members through fostering communication and engaged learning with others. It can involve peer learning and support activities and engagement with the community as well, and skill building around building those positive relationships. And then building knowledge and awareness for social emotional well-being is where you may be delivering content that can underpin all these other types of areas. And so it can be around, mindfulness, self-regulation, teaching different types of information that can help young people to think about their choices. It can be about metacognition, being aware of their kind of thinking patterns. And also learning about social norms that might be harmful or positive. And these types of program components, they can be implemented in a variety of ways. And so there's a long laundry list here around the types of activities that can be used. But the idea of flexible activities really emphasizes that, as Howard said, you're having to respond to the young person in front of you. How do you take different types of activities that might have underlying evidence to think about how you can implement some of these? So just to give you some examples of what different programs have done in this space, goal setting. So one of the programs we looked at called the Real Girls program, participants set up goals related to their school and life success in collaboration with big sisters who were mentors, and then presented their goals to the group. Tracking and monitoring, which is also under building motivation. People in the Resilience Builders program kept a success journal around their efforts to use skills that they learned in a program. And again, journaling and self-reflection is also a practice under mindfulness and self-regulation. And it's been used by the Council for Boys and Young Men to aid reflection around issues around unhealthy masculine norms, diversity, friendships, mentoring, goals, and bullying. Identifying triggers and adaptive strategies is around under self-concept and self-efficacy. The Certified program introduces the idea of cognitive emotional regulation and helps young people think about adaptive and maladaptive strategies to regulate emotions, and then teaches cognitive strategies like acceptance, positive reappraisal, and helps support young people to put those into practice. Building communication skills is under pro-social skills and relationship building. This has been implemented in a variety of ways, but in one program, Color It Real, participants engaged in games and exercises and role playing to build their effective communication skills. And then learning and development and metacognition under self-regulation, under building knowledge and skills for social emotional well-being. This is where there's a content kind of piece, and a program called Project Towards No Drug Abuse teaches students materials around positive and negative thoughts and behavioral loops so that they can learn to monitor their positive and negative thinking and how that's sort of related to then the choices that they might make. So really, when we look at the types of core components that are suggested in terms of the kind of overarching approaches to social emotional well-being, and then the flexible activities that can be used to deliver those different components, we see some different approaches that can be used. That the programs that are supported by evidence have elements around a learning and development element. So you're asking yourself, what content do I need to deliver that is relevant, to my program goals? And then building that knowledge relevant to your program aims and outcomes through learning and development activities, like structured and unstructured learning, multimedia and social media platforms, interactive sessions, review sessions, home learning, homework, and at-home practices are the kinds of flexible activities that can be used. So once you've delivered some kind of content in whatever form, then there's a practice element. So how can you then support activities and skill building so that participants can practice those skills? So that can happen in a group setting where there are activities like role playing, modeling, peer learning, games, creative elements. That's a common way of sort of building the practice element. And then monitoring. So then if there is an effort to teach and to practice, how can that type of change be monitored over time? So how do I sort of see whether changes are sustained, basically? And this can be undertaken by assessments that are administered over time, using self-report from program participants. And we see that, journals are one way that's done. So that's sort of in brief, sort of a way that you can put together some of the components and some of the evidence around social emotional well-being. We wanted to ask you if you see any of those as being particularly relevant to the work that you do. So if you're able to join us on Menti, and Laura's put the code into Mentimeter, we should be able to see, what you think is most relevant from these different core components when people have a moment to put in a vote. And maybe just as we're waiting for any feedback, if you can try it in Mentimeter, you can try it in the chat. Do you find that you do these types of, how does this relate to your practice around building motivation? Okay, self-concept, self-efficacy, and self-confidence is getting some votes. Pro-social skills. Yep, that's still coming up as first. Great. Excellent. Maybe in the chat, if people could give any examples where they use these different components in their practice. I don't know if Kate or Howard, anyone would like to comment about how some of this is used in practice. You're putting into the chat, Howard, but you can also unmute yourself if you choose. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting. I might be foreshadowing what we're doing later, but I'm just reflecting on how much the self-concept, efficacy, and confidence aligns with what you're talking about later in terms of agency and empowerment, whether that's actually.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So clearly self-efficacy and self-concept, so helping young people to build their understanding of themselves, build their self-efficacy, and Mark comments that we see young people with anxiety and depression engaging with youth mental health workers through the Coast Shelter and Central Coast program. Yeah, exactly. So part of this is around sort of building that kind of confidence and outreach and support can be for mental health.
I think maybe the pro-social skills and relationship building stuff also aligns with what you might the youth work tradition might have taught more about association and group work, and working with young people within their peer relationships. So, I mean, some of these, the terminology here, because of its origin in the States and often within psychological discourses, is framed a bit differently. But I think there's a pretty fluid translation that happens across to the kinds of things that we do all the time.
That's right. Yeah, so group work is a major component of that particular approach. And we're getting some comments that a lot of these options are not independent. They're more codependent and interrelated, which we absolutely agree. That's right. Yeah, so it's difficult to tease apart the different kind of program components, but we see that these absolutely do interrelate. And the examples that are going to be available through the evidence portal show how particular programs combine these different aspects and these different practices. Yeah, and Paul sort of comments on that too, in terms of you don't want to, have a false dichotomy and separate them out. They all kind of work together. Yeah,
I think,
that's right.
Amy, those first two to me really speak to that deep relational nature of the work that we do. That is, often we don't have the language to describe that in a core components language, but we know that rapport building and that deep relational work is so important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this really emphasizes that. And relationship is a really difficult one to measure. And I think we'll talk about this with agency and empowerment as well. Some of those things are kind of harder to get at. And so some of the language ends up being that more psychological language, as Howard said. Yeah. Thank you. We wanted to ask as well, I mean, do you find that these sort of resonate? And, we'll also sort of ask if there's sort of, gaps here in terms of social emotional well-being and the way that you foster that in your programs. We're getting some bit of a split there.
And I think
yes,
a lot of the split is about translation, about the way the language works.
Yeah. Yeah. We wanted to invite you, if there's anything that, if you want to share anything that you do in your practice to promote social emotional well-being, we're getting some examples in the chat as well. But any other examples people wanted to give, you can put this in as sort of open-ended. We'd love to hear. Building trust. Yeah.
I think the other thing too is often in youth work practice, we'll do things on the fly. So lots of these things are related to structured programs. So we might not have a mindfulness yoga kind of program, but you've got a young person who's getting angry in the space, and you'll just take them aside and work with them to help things to calm a little. And that might be about breathing, it might be about counting to 10, about helping them with some kind of impulse control. So we might not run a program with it, but the interaction might be all about that within a space.
That's right. Yeah, so these can be used flexibly. And we're getting a lot of great examples here about what people do. And a lot of these do relate, again, it might be kind of a terminology difference, but, encouraging self-care, again, there's sort of good evidence around that, building resilience, which you can do through these different ways around, skills, pro-social skills, sort of metacognition, giving people strategies, strong rapport and building that relationship, as Kate mentioned, educating young people on their rights, role modeling and empowerment. And we're going to come back to the concept of empowerment. Creative sessions, which they get to produce something they're proud of. And that is one of the flexible activities under some of the core components, giving people a space to have a voice. Yeah, voice and agency is going to come back up again. We have other example, unconditional regard about relationships, ensuring they're not judged, supporting through difficult sense of self. Yeah, self-care and self-advocacy, goal setting. We see that coming up. Yeah, developing self and voice, advocating. Yeah, great. And we'll come to some of these. Some of these will emerge in the next evidence review that we're talking about as well. Great. So great examples. Thank you. And again, I think, you know, we see a lot of evidence for these types of practices, just with different language. So as mentioned before, we did note limitations and gaps in social emotional well-being in the evidence review, you know, particularly in terms of the evidence base that we're building here in Australia. But then also that, you know, some of the key things that you mentioned, they didn't quite come out in terms of the literature, and you know, working with Youth Work New South Wales and Youth Action, they identify the importance of practices that foster agency and empowerment, which were mentioned also people in the examples people gave. And so we formulated a protocol to try to cast a wider net in terms of literature, and that led to the second evidence review, which we'll talk about now. And so this is really focusing much broader about the concept of youth work programs and practices with young people aged 10 to 24. And looking at youth work within Australia and then similar jurisdictions, and highlighting some of the key practices and theories and programs that characterize youth work with young people, and that informs the report that you receives. Yeah. So this, for this particular evidence review, we used a different methodological approach because, again, we identified that it's difficult to capture some of the really good work that people do, and that, you know, the structured programs, and as Narelle said, it's sort of, you know, this, when we're looking at the evidence review for social emotional well-being, that was all about structured programs that met a particular evidence threshold of having that quasi-experimental research. In this other evidence review, we cast a much broader net, and including the invitation to share the work that's being done here, you know, locally by organizations. So we looked much more broadly. We looked at youth work. We did some additional searches to make sure that we could capture the evidence that's available in terms of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. And then we sort of synthesized the content, but in a way that was, you know, attempting to be kind of really capturing more of what we know around youth work. We still did, you know, focus on the literature that's, you know, from English-speaking countries. We really focused on, you know, youth workers and youth work organizations, and you know, interventions that are sort of focusing on young people. But we excluded some particular types of interventions, and we want to kind of acknowledge this, that, you know, youth work is such a broad sort of set of practices that are out there. So we did exclude certain types just because they almost would sort of require their own review. And, you know, in particular, a type of intervention that's very important, you know, here in Australia around youth accommodation work, we had to exclude, but while acknowledging that, you know, transitional and crisis accommodation is a very important to practice in this space, but it was sort of too big to include, you know, within this particular review. So we received, you know, quite, you know, even with those exclusion criteria, a very large volume of material to look at. And we, you know, had almost, you know, 700 references across, you know, a broad range of types of literature. And we were able to capture some material that looked at practice with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, you know, which is highlighted in the report. We did some screening and then kind of brought that down in terms of the relevance of what we were looking at, and still, you know, sort of had a large volume of 428 sources to integrate in. There was also a process where DCJ sent out an invitation to submit work that's being done, and Youth Work New South Wales and Youth Action also shared that request, and we received information, you know, about such as information reports and program evaluations that capture the work that you do, and we integrated that as well into the report. So you'll see that we highlighted some of the good practices that are available, you know, that are being done here in New South Wales. So we received submissions from 17 organizations, and those again are featured in the report, so you can have a look at their report to see, you know, how that aligns. And from those 17 organizations we received over 60 submissions. So we really thank people for their time in sharing the documentation that they have on their practice so that we can capture that, because that's so often missing in terms of evidence reviews. And then we, approached the whole idea of coding quite differently. So rather than trying to kind of just identify, the interventions, we looked much more broadly in terms of giving that context about what is youth work, and we'll go into that. We did try to characterize youth work interventions that came from this review, and then also ones that specifically focus on agency and empowerment, and we'll share those. And then we looked at the submissions that we received and highlighted good youth work practice as part of this work. And we again appreciate the opportunity to work with DCJ and Youth Work and New South Wales and Youth Action in this process. So I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca, who's going to share with you what we found in terms of the area of what is youth work.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, we had 4 research areas kind of emerge from this review. The first of which provides what is youth work, provides context and historical background to our review. So we had 30 sources relating to the history and definition of youth work and 73 relating to theory and key concepts. However, overwhelmingly, our search results really related to the youth work profession and the professionalisation of youth work, which came to a total of 147 references. We found that youth work refers to a really broad range of supportive and educative practices connected with young people across a range of different settings. And the breadth of meaning encompassed by the term youth work is acknowledged as both advantageous and problematic in the literature. So while this breadth enables flexibility and creativity for practitioners on the ground, it can also inhibit disciplinary cohesiveness, which I go into a little bit more later, which has consequences for researching youth work. So we've cited Professor Sercombe in the review, who obviously is here today, and he speaks well to these claims of youth work being difficult to define, and arguing that actually it's quite easy to discuss what youth workers do, but it's more of a challenge to articulate what makes youth work distinctive. And so the definition that Professor Sercombe provides is that youth work is a professional relationship in which the young person is engaged as the primary client in their social context. So next slide, Amy. So yeah, we've just got a little Menti question here. What words would you guys use to define youth work? And just popping them into the Mentimeter, and we'll start seeing some results pop up. Yep, relational, absolutely. That was a standout for sure. Young person centered, absolutely. Empowerment. Yeah, great. Yeah, fantastic. So if anyone else wants to chime in as well on some of the results that are coming through here, this is looking good. There's also, just while this is going on in the review, there's a couple of definitions, so it's good to check, and there is an Australia-wide definition that's the Australian. Yeah, there's some more definitions in the review. Yes, that was what went out of my mind. Thank you, Andrew. The national definition of youth work by AAC in 2013 is that's featured in the review. Beautiful, okie dokie. So we wanted to provide some context without writing a full history. So we have some great sources that do this that are cited in the review in the further reading. So we placed two conceptions of youth work alongside each other. So we had a First Nations conception of raising young people, presented by Queensland author Maria Lukashenko, so referring to Murri culture, and a Western post-World War II conception of youth work in English-speaking like jurisdictions. So youth work in First Nations communities, specifically Murri community, is a really holistic, involved process. So it's a universal provision of rearing youth as opposed to a sort of deficit oriented targeted practice that we do see more of a targeted practice today, and there has been a shift from universal to targeted youth work. Young people are raised in a culture, in First Nations cultures, that values more collective rights and resource sharing. So obviously this is quite a tonal change from a more individualistic culture of Western cultures that has more of a focus on the development of individuality and self-reliance. And finally, there are different traditions and processes for boys and girls in Murri culture. So placing this against Western iterations of youth work in Commonwealth countries is really heavily influenced by British social work. British social work is based on informal education, more in the review, as informal and conversational style of youth work. So over time, British influenced youth work has effectively shifted, as I mentioned, from those more universal origins to a more targeted, specialised provision with young people who are categorised as vulnerable or at risk. So that's the kind of youth work that we think of and that we're referring to in this discussion today. Older versions of youth work might be, or more universal provisions might be thought of as more things like Scouts, Duke of Edinburgh, kind of more recreational, leisure-based programs. And finally, youth work in North America has more of a kind of therapeutic care bent, which does inform our youth work here today as well. So next slide, please, Amy. So as I mentioned, a really large proportion of our resources that were identified related to the youth work profession, and 4 key themes emerged here. Namely, there are just such significant differences between education, qualification, and accreditation standards for youth work that differ significantly between English-speaking countries, and there is a chart that kind of compares this in the review, and it's quite surprising. As I mentioned earlier, youth work also as a scholarly discipline does lack cohesion and and a common language. So while there is some really robust scholarship, there is sort of that lack of cohesion because youth work encompasses such a broad range of practice and activities that differ across different countries, as we were chatting about in the chat. It does make it harder to study and rigorously test, particularly using quantitative approaches like, randomized control trials or quasi-experimental design studies. There's also debate in the field about the pros and cons of professionalization. So a handful of dissenters argue that professionalization risks the creativity and flexibility of youth work, but largely the literature sort of indicates that practitioners more support professionalization. And finally, the 4th theme to emerge was that challenges experienced in the youth work sector really echo those experienced in the NGO and care sector broadly. So we have issues like burnout, staff turnover, and the consequences of short-term outcomes-based funding. So next slide, please. So we identified the following key practices as sort of the non-negotiable bread and butter elements of youth work. And while different programs and interventions might draw from different youth work theories or different approaches, the elements below really have to underpin all forms of youth work practice or organisational policy and procedure. So ethics, obviously having a code of ethics is really important, and into which is tied supervision and reflective practice. So really important for conducting reflexive and thoughtful youth work. Conducting culturally safe youth work with First Nations youth is obviously particularly important in Australian context, but really this extends to youth work in any colonised country. And working from an anti-oppressive and trauma-informed approach is really essential. So this is, you know, kind of what you need to do good youth work, as I'm sure you all know. So next slide, please, Amy. Thank you. So we also have, so I guess building on these non-negotiable elements, we have a range of these theories and approaches that we identified as being most relevant in practice today in an Australian context. So this isn't a comprehensive list. This is just kind of what stands out in the literature, and you'll notice a lot of overlap between these categories. So while there's similarities, you know, they are kind of distinct. So there's obviously similarities between, you know, civic youth work and like strengths-based approaches. There's a lot of overlap, but there are specific theories that inform these, and this is passed out more in the review. So I think that might be my last slide. So I'll hand over to Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck. Okay, so I'm going to take you through research area 2, which canvassed youth work interventions. We identified a total of 310 references from our searches that spoke to interventions in the youth workspace. And we also received 33 submissions from New South Wales youth organisations that we categorised under this area of research. Unsurprisingly, youth work interventions have an incredibly broad scope in terms of focus, outcomes, delivery modes. Overall, though, we did find that most interventions focus both on transformation of the young person in their social and environmental context and transformation of that context itself. So to better understand, I guess, the nature of youth work interventions, we iteratively broke down all the interventions we came across into subcategories. And specifically, we found that most interventions could be divisible either by procedural aspect or by their focus on particular subsets of vulnerable youth. So next slide, please, Amy. The interventions, just starting with the interventions that were kind of distinguishable from their procedural qualities, we have a list here on the slide on the left, things like creative youth work, outdoor physical activity-based youth work, educational learning-based youth work, digital remote and mobile youth work, crime prevention and diversion, case management, mentoring, and detached youth work. And we're going to go through these individually in a second, but a list here on the right of interventions that we kind of distinguish based on their focus on particular subsets of youth. We had interventions targeting runaway, homeless, or street-connected youth, culturally and linguistically diverse youth, youth affected by domestic or family violence, youth at risk for suicidal ideation or suicide, and youth transitioning out of home care or custody. So I'm going to very briefly give some headline descriptions of these subcategories of youth work interventions, just noting that many of these programs and practices can obviously fall across different categories, and these descriptions really just reflect the interventions identified in this review. So it's by no means an exhaustive list, and I'm sure we can illuminate more of the practices that you're participating in and working with in the youth workspace later in some discussions. Just starting with creative youth work. These interventions really just involve a creative component combined with some kind of relational or experiential learning. So examples we had from the literature were things like hip hop activities and theatre projects. And the research showed that these programs can be really effective at facilitating expressive learning and kind of foregrounding youth's own experiences in their learning activities and bringing together diverse groups of young people as well. We then have outdoor physical activity-based youth work. And this really included a very broad spectrum of anything like learning or play, exercise, or recreational activities in outdoor settings. So examples were sports participation programs, which are obviously more structured. And then we also have kind of unstructured outdoor play and learning programs. And the research really showed that these different programs can help with a broad variety of positive outcomes for youth. Some of these included building resilience, leadership, well-being, and social competency. Then we have informal learning-based youth work, and that canvasses interventions that incorporate some kind of alternative or informal learning with youth work practitioners in schools or community-based settings. We have some examples there on the slide, but I'll just move to the next slide. We have digital or remote or mobile youth work, and that's relatively self-explanatory. And digital or remote youth work has shown benefits in terms of working with young people whose maybe personal preferences or just even geographic location make it otherwise difficult for them to engage in face-to-face programs. Mentoring can take a number of forms, including informal and formal, and obviously speaks to the relational component that's pretty key to youth work practice. And that's been shown to enhance mental health, reduce delinquency, as well as a host of other benefits around skill development and academic achievements. And finally, we have crime prevention programs that focus on diverting youth from criminal activity. And these can also take a number of forms and have variously been shown to have promise in preventing criminal behaviour. So next we have youth work interventions that are distinguishable by their focus on particular subsets of youth. Okay, across the board, evaluations of these kinds of interventions tends to just highlight the importance of tailoring programs to the individual circumstances and needs of particular cohorts of youth, which I think we've already picked up in some of the Menti discussions so far. This was particularly pronounced in research on programs that target runaway, homeless, or street-connected youth. Similarly, with culturally and linguistically diverse youth, the research shows they can face unique risk factors as well as benefit from unique protective factors, but that these are in no way homogenous across all CALD youth. So again, it's really important to consider the individual circumstances of each young person within these programs. The research has shown that employment of youth workers in schools and extension of school-based youth work programs has shown promise for the reduction of suicides among school-aged youth in Australia. We also found that specialist one-to-one support or group work sessions have been shown to be effective in helping youth affected by domestic violence. And finally, youth policies like extended care have shown promise for young people transitioning out of home care or custody, but we really need more research in this area to draw some definitive conclusions about what works for these cohorts. As Amy mentioned earlier, we did separately look at interventions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth and found that there's a lack of evidence evaluating youth work interventions. But certain program types like sports and recreation, arts and mentoring programs have variously been shown to benefit Aboriginal youth. Importantly, across all of this research that is available, the emphasis is really on maintaining cultural and historical awareness, embedding culturally appropriate methods of communication, and considering Indigenous teaching and learning styles when developing and administering these programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. So some key takeaways from this summary, and it's very brief, of youth work interventions. They're very diverse, but they do tend to focus both on the young person and their context. And we did try to distill 4 components of best practice youth work from the synthesis, borrowing from one of our systematic reviews that we included. And these are firstly connectivity. So it's important that the programs are obviously relationship-based, they're grounded in the community in which they operate, and they're able to be long-term and sustainable. That there's a strengths-based component, so it's equally important that programs foster independence and autonomy. Capacity building, which really refers to integration of staff professional development that's ongoing, as well as effective research and evaluation into program development, as well as administration. And contextual and systemic considerations, so the importance of taking into account the macro context. So at this stage, I think we want to turn it over to all of you, as well as our presenters in general, and ask which of the following youth work intervention categories resonate with the work you do in this space. So I think we're going to get a little bit of a pie chart happening here as you maybe let us know. And if there are other categories that we haven't picked up, please do let us know in the chat as well. Okay, so we're getting a fair amount of creative youth work. That's really interesting. And education or learning, as well as case management, yeah. Mentoring. It's interesting where these, where the majority of these answers lie, especially with, for example, creative youth work. There isn't a lot of evidence, relatively speaking, in the review on creative youth work. It was a category that we picked up, but it definitely didn't have the kind of preponderance of literature that some of the other categories had. But I think that does speak to the fact that, you know, there are limitations in our review process in terms of we are picking up predominantly academic literature, which speaks largely to structured programs, and obviously maybe programs with a creative component don't have the kind of evaluations and don't end up in the academic literature. So that's really interesting. Yeah, so it seems like, okay, yeah. No, that's okay, Amy. It does just seem like we've got a kind of split between creative education and case management and mentoring as well. That's great. Okay. So moving on to research area 3, that's kind of, this is the focus of the review in terms of this was the kind of gap that we identified from the socio-emotional wellbeing review. And it was really interesting to see the Menti responses earlier around the socio-emotional wellbeing questions, because a lot of you are picking up on, you know, agency and empowerment as terms that we kind of weren't capturing in that review, and that those were reflected in your responses. So we did obviously conduct targeted searches in this review around agency and empowerment, and we found that youth work is leading the way in terms of moving away from this deficit-oriented, risk-averse approach and giving primacy to youth participation in decision-making, as well as processes that shape youth organisations. We had 93 references, including 24 submissions in this category of research. And again, we broke these down into subcategories. These included relationship-based youth work, youth participatory action research, youth adult partnerships, youth organising, and needs-led youth work. So next slide, please, Amy. We might go one more slide further. Yeah. So we'll just start with relationship-based youth work. Obviously, it's already been picked up in our discussions, but the relationship between the youth work practitioner and the young person is often the crux of many of the youth work interventions that we identified in the review, and certain aspects of this relationship were highlighted as best practice in our research. These included constant engagement, being responsive and adaptable to the needs of the young person, foregrounding their voice in decision-making processes, and developing trust, rapport, as well as a boundary-enabled relationship. So moving on to interventions that foster agency and empowerment, we did find that many youth work interventions directly or indirectly foster agency and empowerment in their young clients. I think Beck spoke briefly to the kind of issues around terminology. Obviously, there are differences between jurisdictions as well as like definitional inconsistencies in how we define and think about terms like agency and empowerment. So we're not always picking up all of the references or studies that might speak to these outcomes or issues. But the programs and approaches that we covered today, they vary a lot, but they do converge in their goal of improving youth outcomes by either involving youth in activities that are considered meaningful to them, or promoting participatory practices. So starting with youth participatory action research, this category of youth work intervention really just engages the young person as a co-researcher in the design and administration of research projects. And the research projects tend to focus on social problems. And so there's that community aspect to thinking about broader problems that are relevant to their community and their environmental context. Youth-adult partnerships prioritize young people's right to participate in democratic processes and aim to develop skill building and empowerment through shared activities. We then have youth organising. This represents a category of intervention that gives primacy to youth in all program processes, including relationship building, identification of problems, action planning, and implementation. And finally, we had a category of needs-led youth work, which again prioritizes youth participation, and it really requires practitioners to continually focus on youth's needs. So I guess the bottom line or recurring theme across these programs and practices is that they advocate for young people's right to participate and foster agency and empowerment by giving primacy to their voice, and promoting equitable relationships and increasing youth participation in decision-making processes. So I think we now have another discussion question, which again, we can open up to everyone. How do agency and empowerment feature in your programs and practices? This will just be, I think, an open text discussion. Primary outcome. Are there certain practices that you associate with achieving that outcome that we may or may not have touched on? Yeah.
One of the things that I'm wondering about is while the language of empowerment has been around for a while, the language of agency is kind of emerging, I think, within our field. I'm kind of curious to see if this is language in the notion of agency in terms of young people's capacity to act in their own lives and to feel like their lives belong to them, and to be active in their communities and their peer groups and in the kind of development of their own trajectories and destinies, I suppose. I'm curious to see if this is language that people use at the moment in the field and whether it makes sense to them. Yeah.
Sorry, Amy, I can't scroll through it, but maybe you could help read out some of the ones.
Yeah, I was just going to do that. And in response to Howard's comment, people want to comment on empowerment being a core value of the agency. But we also see a lot of people using the word voice and youth-led, being youth-led in new programs, making sure youth, that's front and center, youth-led and asking for their choices. So it looks like, yeah, maybe perhaps youth-led might be we have a focus on youth-led practice. That might be a more resonating term, possibly, than empowerment. And Mark commented the language is pretty foreign to young people, maybe in terms of empowerment. We might move on and share then some good practice that people have provided in terms of the work that they do in relation to these areas. Heading over to Beck.
Yeah, fabulous. All right. So, sorry. So we received some really excellent submissions, which were just an absolute treat to go through. Everyone was very enthusiastic to send them through, and it was just, yeah, really, really cool to kind of collate them all into a resource. So we received a total of 60 submissions from 17 different organizations, individuals, and partnerships. We saw a few really great partnership examples, particularly from state-based bodies and NGOs. So we then categorized those submissions into 4 categories. So we had health and well-being, community, culture, and connection, education, employment and training, and youth work during COVID-19. So it's really important to note here that the submissions that we've received from the organisations here reflect just like a tiny slice of the total works from each organisation. So many of these organisations or individuals provide a wider range or even wraparound support services. And we've made a point in the review of including multiple organizational hyperlinks to the full range of works provided by each provider and links to the actual submissions if those are documents that are publicly available already, just to try and feed as much information back as possible. So yeah, next. So, oh, sorry. So our first four themes that came through health and wellbeing. So common themes here were person-centered care, which I know was something that came up a lot earlier in one of the Menti questions, trauma-informed care. And both of these approaches we might also remember from earlier as being those non-negotiables of youth work. So creativity and expression was really central to the success of the programs run by Blue Mountains Women's Health Resource Centre and STARTS in their respective Artspace and Capoeira Angola programs. Submissions from Save the Children and Headspace and MCCI partnership both really effectively championed youth voice through civic participation activities designed to promote mental health and well-being. So just relating back to the chat, there was a comment from Kate about post-disaster work with COVID and the bushfires, and both of these organisations did submissions pertaining to those. There was a great trauma-informed practice framework submitted by Project Youth, which was a good example of not just good practice of supporting mental well-being with the young people, but also just at a broad organisational level as well. So next slide, please. So our second area is community, culture and connection. So the common goal among these submitters was to foster really authentic and meaningful connections with young people and their communities. Humanity Matters and Street Work both achieved this by doing outreach-based street work to meet people like where they are at, crucially in their communities. So not necessarily having to come to the worker, but the workers going to them. Humanity Matters and Weave both also practice a slightly different form of outreach in the form of street festivals or celebrations. Humanity Matters have a food truck, which looks fabulous. SSI and Weave both submitted evaluations which really illustrated how they honour the culture of their service users by ensuring service user voice and participation is really at the forefront of service planning and design. So really meaningful inclusion. And we had some slightly different submissions from Peter Slattery and Demetrius Papalexis, from founder of Solgen, both operating as expert consultants in the youth workspace, seeking to enhance community strengths through strategic engagement with NGOs or communities that use them for consulting services and the provision of workshops and resources. So next slide, please. The third area was education, employment and training. So the common provisions here was the provision of advice and resources during that often challenging transition from high school to adulthood, to workplace. So Fairhaven Create Foundation and Southern Youth and Family Services offered support to young people transitioning from school to independence by providing advice on either further education pathways and training, or various employment pathways. So Fairhaven and Southern Youth and Family Services also both offer supported training opportunities for young people, which can serve as a stepping stone to employment, supported employment, or mainstream employment services. And both of these organizations also run social enterprise businesses as well, which is very cool. So next slide, please. And finally, youth work during COVID-19. So the submissions that we received here really spoke to a very timely practice adaptation and effective messaging at a time where, you know, we weren't really sure of anything, and we were getting different messages and communications every day. But these submissions, so the projects completed by New South Wales Multicultural Communications Service and SSI as a partnership, and the Northern Sydney Youth Health Promotion teams both produced these accessible, relatable online resources for young people relating to mental wellbeing during the pandemic. So obviously they're both available in the review. And a partnership between Illawarra-based New South Wales Multicultural Health Service and MCCI resulted in a really effective COVID messaging campaign led by young people from CALD backgrounds to bring messaging about best practice around COVID prevention within their community. So yeah, handing back to Amy. Oh, no, sorry. We have a
no, we wanted to, yeah, that's right. We wanted to invite, you know, what else could we highlight in terms of good practice in the youth workspace? We know that, you know, when we put the call out, you know, there was, you know, people might have been constrained in terms of time, or might not have had documentation that, you know, they could provide. So are there any other things that you think we should be highlighting in terms of good practice in the youth workspace that you'd like to share? I might actually ask people to put that into the chat just because okay, here we go. More focus on hard outcomes. Okay, thank you. So we will outcomes. Yeah. So perhaps evaluations in terms of evaluations that focus on outcomes. Okay, therapeutic programs, sound therapy and play therapy. Thank you.
I can speak to the therapeutic based programs. I would say that these probably weren't captured in our searches because they probably tend to be conducted by different occupations, so more clinical psychologists, social workers, and we really had an early intervention focus in this review.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interest in outcomes focus and how to measure outcomes. And I think that takes us to some of the closing points that we want to make in the interest of time. And I also want to sort of invite, you know, Anthony back into the conversation too, in terms of, you know, where do we go from here in terms of evidence for the sector, you know, the intentions around continuing education and engagement and discussion in the space. Anthony?
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, look, the next steps from here is thanks for your feedback today. I think that's been really important. It's great to hear from everybody in relation to the evidence. So from here, we'll look to kind of update and finalise the evidence reviews. We'll make them available on the DCJ evidence portal, which is a publicly available portal. If you haven't had a chance to have a look at that, yeah, I'd encourage you to have a look at that. Probably by the end of the year, hopefully by early next year, we'll have all the evidence, the youth evidence up there. We're working with Youth Action and Youth Work New South Wales on a plan around how we further work with the sector, engage the sector around the evidence and what we do next. Most likely that'll involve, you know, some further engagement sessions with you across the state. But yeah, look, certainly we'll be in contact with you in the next couple of months about that. And I know that Kate and Howard are doing some further thinking around what that might look like as well. Look, there is some gaps, as we know. It's been highlighted by the team today and by yourselves in terms of the research, and particularly obviously the scope of both of these evidence reviews. As we kind of mentioned earlier, there's some significant areas of youth work, particularly in homelessness and accommodation, for example, that we didn't include in this scope, given the size and the importance and the wealth of kind of content and information available. You know, I would suggest, you know, they're kind of probably worthy of their own evidence review. So it's good to kind of, you know, understand and clarify those gaps, and we can do some thinking about kind of what, you know, where we go with that. Look, we want to continue to work with the sector and support the sector around, you know, translating the evidence into practice. We know that a lot of services are already doing a lot of this work, you know, and so we want to make this, you know, this evidence available and, you know, be usable by services going forward. So yeah, look, we look forward to the opportunity to continue those conversations with you. I'd also just like to take the opportunity now to thank Amy, Rebecca and Laura for the presentation today and for all the work they've done, and also to Howard and Kate for their work and their ongoing commitment, and importantly I'd like to acknowledge and thank you that have participated today, but all the other information and materials that you provided into the viewers was incredibly helpful. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. I think any closing remarks from Kate or Howard? We had a plug for the Youth Action conference. Yes,
I did. I would like to plug it. It is an opportunity. Howard and Amy will be presenting on a panel where this will be discussed further, but it's also just an opportunity to, Howard said really early on that a lot of the evidence we use is going to people we know doing good work and learning from them. And so this is such a great opportunity to come and be around, you know, our tribe, our people, and find out, you know, what is that good work that people are doing and what can you take back into your places and spaces.
And I think I'd like to say, from the point of view of the professional association, you know, Youth Work New South Wales has only been in place now for just under a year. And I think for being this early in our adventure, the opportunity to be involved with the department and with your team, Amy, was really useful for us, and I think hopefully useful for you. And I think it did enable us to bring the perspectives of on-the-ground youth workers to this kind of process and to try and maximise the usefulness of this kind of evidence to practitioners in the sector.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just wanted to close by saying, just acknowledging Narelle's comment, it's really difficult to measure the excellent work that you do. And so it's hard to translate that in terms of a relationship, a feeling, you know, Howard said earlier, the look that you get from a young person. And so it's a balanced conversation about, you know, where is there utility in evidence? You know, where can there be learnings in terms of enhancing your practice? But I know that will be an ongoing conversation, you know, among this sector with DCJ. So thank you everyone very much for your time today. And please do contact DCJ if you didn't receive the 2 documents that were sent out in advance.
And if anybody wants to know more about the professional association, just contact me.
Very good. Thank you. We'll close it there. And the recording will be available if you want to share it with colleagues. Thank you.